Okay, we're back at Senate Education, and we are about to jump in on our continuing the conversation around COVID relief funding. We had Mr. Pearl and Ms. Parker in last week, and today we have, let's see, Dr. Bushi, Ms. Briggs, and then Mark and Brianna are with us as well. And it looks like we have Mr. Klein here as well for a guest appearance. So, Dr. Bushi, welcome back to Senate Education. Thanks for sharing some thoughts on where we are with regard to COVID funding from the agency's perspective. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make sure I'm not muted. For the record, Heather Boucher, Deputy Secretary for the Agency of Education, and I am joined today by Jill Briggs, who is our project manager for all things ESSER and some other stuff in
Dr.
our
Boucher,
agency.
I apologize for the mispronunciation of your name. I did consult someone who will remain anonymous who said that I was mispronouncing it before, but now just looks like I have it correct. So for those listening.
Yes, it's Boucher, like touche. It's
perfect.
It's French. Half of my dad's uncles spell it with an R still, which is not the Vermont pronunciation either. I'm from Northern New York. We could spend a whole saga of testimony on the derivation of my name. But yes, and I'm thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very used to mispronunciation, so no hard feelings at all here, not a worry. So yes, so I think we're going to start with Jill just giving a high level presentation, very high level. We know that this is a very active conversation at the moment. So she will give a high level of sort of just the facts, and then we'll be certainly open for certainly open to answer any questions. I will also, hopefully the committee is interested in knowing a bit more about where we are with recovery efforts, and I'm happy to update folks on that.
That'd be great.
Take it away, Jill. Sorry, Mr. Chair, may Jill take it away.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Jill Briggs Campbell from Agency of Education. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's all right. I just have some high level slides. I'm going to try not to swim in the acronyms, but I know that you've had a lot of testimony, and I know Steve's been here and Brianna's been here sort of giving you the basics a lot. So please feel free to jump in and say, what are you talking about at any point, if that's helpful. All right, and if I could get permission to share, that would be great.
Yes, please.
There we go. Well, okay, great. Okay. And I just want to make sure that I can share the correct screen with you. Okay. So are you all seeing the slides at this point?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, great, thank you. So as I said, I'm going to try to keep this to a very high level. You're familiar with ESSER. I do like to sort of take a couple of steps back before we dive into the acronym soup here. As you all are aware, we've had 3 major COVID-19 federal relief bills. The CARES Act, which was all the way back in March 27th of this last year, and which I've heard in the legislature often the CRF and CARES are conflated because that's the piece that the legislature was working with. In Agency of Education, we sort of talk about the other programs that went with that. So we have ESSER, GEAR, and CRF were all federal programs under the CARES Act that had education funding that we administer. Then we have in December of last year, the CARISA Act, as we fondly call it, so that we don't lose our minds. This include ESSER 2, GEAR 2, a new program called GEAR EANS, and I'll break these down in just a moment, an extension of the CRF fund through December 31st of this year, and some additional programming for child nutrition. And then, of course, in March 11th of this year, the American Rescue Plan Act, which has included GEAR 3, or I'm sorry, ESSER 3 or ESSER ARP, GEAR EANS 2, and a supplement to the IDEA, which is for special education funding. So that's sort of the lay of the land here. I do have a couple of slides that sort of break out the family tree. I find this a helpful way, being a visual learner, to sort of understand how these all work together. For the purposes of our discussion today, we'll be focusing on the elementary and secondary school.
Yes, Senator Hooker, do you want that a little bigger?
No, I just wonder if Ms. Briggs could email this set of slides to us.
Yeah, and you should have had that last week, but I know we got canceled, but I'll be happy to. I've made a couple of updates to it, Senator Hooker, that's sort of hot
We
off the
have our
presses.
committee assistant here. Jeannie, is it already up?
Yes.
Okay, it's already up. So we'll look under your name and track it down. Thank you.
Okay,
Wonderful.
thank you. Sorry.
No worries, no worries.
Excuse me, I'm not sure that this particular, I don't know that I've received this particular document yet, but the other documents from last week are up.
Okay, I'll ensure that if this didn't make it over, that you do get a copy of it. Absolutely. All right, so for ESSER 1, a couple of, or ESSER program generally, there's a couple of high-level points to be made. The first is that the funding comes from the U.S. Department of Education. 90% of all ESSER funds go to the LEAs, which is our supervisory unions and districts. So those two things are synonymous. And then there's a 10% set aside, which of course is a topic for discussion today. There is a broad range of uses, and how I would define those is that anything that is an allowable use under any of our regular federal funding programs. So that's our title funds, our IDEA, Perkins, which is used to support our career technical education centers. Those are all allowable uses for ESSER. In addition, there are 13 additional categories of spending. So to say that the allowable uses are broad is a really a true statement. This is probably our most broad funding source that we have. And all those additional 13 categories cover a range of activities specifically to address COVID. So it's part of the COVID response, and all uses of ESSER funds need to have a COVID context is sort of the language that we use when we're evaluating applications. So just a couple high level things on that. The other bucket is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. This is also through the U.S. Department of Education. It goes to the governor's office, and then it was determined by the governor's office for GEAR 1 that the administration wanted the Agency of Education to administer that funding program, and specifically targeted CTE centers that were sort of falling into a funding gap between CRF and ESSER. And so that program also has a broad range of uses. All of the funds for that were awarded by March 20th of this year, actually even sooner than that, by December of last year. And then you all are very familiar with the CRF fund. It is important to note that the funding source here is the U.S. Department of Treasury, and I sort of signal that because depending on the funding source, there's entirely separate regulatory frameworks around the use of the funds. The Vermont State Legislature allocated $103 million over three separate acts, Acts 120, 136, and 154, to 5 grants which were administered by the Agency of Education, a much more restricted use, range of uses. And originally the program went through December 30th of this last year. And for the purposes of the grants that are administered by the Agency of Education, our programs ended December 30th of last year with one exception, and that was the Child Nutrition Equipment Grant. Because of supply chain delays, we extended that grant out through the end of April. And we did have $15 million in unused funds that came from the LEA grant. And as you may already be aware of, we identified way back in December that we wanted those funds, we requested that those funds be reallocated to the Indoor Air Quality Project, which is run through Efficiency Vermont in partnership with AOE. We've been very supportive of that program and our partnership with them, and have found it to be very successful. And currently, the extension of that program or renewal of that program is sitting in the H315 bill. I'll pause here because this is sort of the high level of all of the programs. Are there any questions?
Any questions? I'm not seeing any.
Okay. All right. So having laid that groundwork, I'm going to breeze through a few of the slides. So again, please let me know if there's any questions that arise. The Carissa Act extended several of these programs, as I've already signaled. So ESSER 2, we went from $31 million in ESSER 1 to $126 million in ESSER 2. And as you're already aware of, most likely in ESSER 3, it's $280 million. So we've seen a significant increase. There is also a Gear 2. The governor has not identified a priority for that particular program, sort of waiting to make a strategic decision, again, looking for those entities that may be falling into a funding gap. And then it also created a new program, whereas ESSER 1 included an equitable services requirement whereby our supervisory unions were required to provide goods and services to independent schools, eligible independent schools. That provision's been taken out of ESSER 2 and 3, and essentially the burden of running equitable services has now been shifted onto the Agency of Education. So we have just released this application in the past week. We're partnering very, very closely with our independent schools to provide support for what is essentially a program that nobody has ever tried to create or run before. So we're providing very intensive support for our independent schools to help this be successful. And then of course the CRF fund, which as we know is extended. And then finally, the ARPA Act includes.
Would you, since we do not, our committee assistant doesn't have this, can you enlarge it?
Yeah, I'll try. I've got a couple of things at the top of my screen that are causing me to not be able to do that. So
or if Dr. Boucher has it, perhaps she could email it right away to our committee assistant, and then our committee assistant could forward it to all of us.
Yeah, apologies for that.
No problem.
If you go to slide view, then it won't.
Yeah, what I'm encountering is that, here, I'm going to try stopping sharing and trying again. There's a whole line of things from Zoom across the top of my screen that I can't control. So let's try one more time here.
Jill, if you want to quickly send it to me via Teams or something, I can forward it on to the committee.
Will do right now. Thank you.
And Jeannie, if you would email it out, that would be great.
I apologize. I cannot even view the top of my screen. It's very frustrating. So that's coming out right now. Apologies for that. And thank you for bearing with me on that. Okay, I will forge ahead while that's coming around to you, if that's okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, and so for ARPA, as I've already indicated, we have ESSER 3 and the amount of funding has gone up significantly. One brand new piece of news to share, as I said, there's a few things that are sort of hot off the presses here. We did just get the initial grant notification, the award for ESSER 3 just a few days ago, and included in that is what's known as the tidings waiver, and essentially it takes your federal award period, which originally ended 9/30 of 2023, and extends it out an additional year. So what's important here for the purposes of our supervisory unions in terms of planning and also for the agency is that these funds will now go out through September 30th of 2024. So an unusually long tail for using these funds and being able to plan strategically. Okay, so just a couple of quick updates on AOE COVID-19 funding work. There's been a lot going on. It's been a busy March. So on the 20th of March, the ESSER 1 applications closed. And as of like this morning, all but one of the ESSER applications have approved awards, and the last one is in review. So we are going to end up awarding all of the ESSER LEA grants, and we are also providing quite a great deal of support around ESSER 2. That application was released just 2 days later on March 22nd. And this is part of something that Dr. Boucher will speak to, which is the connection between ESSER 2 and recovery planning, and how the agency is offering really intensive support and guidance to the field around strategic uses. In addition, with the ESSER 2 application, we released a sort of package of fiscal guidance to help the field. One of those was an ESSER 2 fiscal guidance document that included strategic uses of funds and how our supervisory unions and districts might think about using these sort of one-time funds. And we also released an ARPA overview memo to sort of begin the planning process, and a very large document that's sort of a toolkit that is the federal funding planning guidance. And I am happy to send links to all of this. This is all available on our COVID-19 federal emergency funding webpage, which links to all of the separate funds and guidance for all of it. But I'm happy to send you the links directly. And essentially what that document does is it's built around the recovery planning work. And if a business manager or curriculum director has an identified need, they can go into this document, they will see it, click on it, and be able to identify all of the federal funds that could potentially pay for that need. So not just ESSER, but your title funds, your IDEA, and the intention there is to help them maximize the use of all of their federal funding so that we don't have a case where they're sending back their regular federal funds and even maybe creating a maintenance of effort issue down the line. So we're trying to help them plan very strategically. We also released the GEAR EANS application, which is that emergency assistance for non-public schools. That's the sort of independent school funding, on the 23rd, and we just held our first office hours yesterday, and we'll be holding additional office hours. And part of the support that we're providing here is we have teams that are dedicated to each and every independent school that applies, and they'll go through a consultation process to help them not only complete the application successfully, but also think about how to strategically use their funds. So we're providing quite a lot of support around that. And then finally, we released the ESSER 3 allocations to the supervisory unions and districts so that they can start planning. And on the 24th, the Agency of Education received a partial award, and this is very different for ESSER 3. The U.S. Department of Education released 2/3 of that $280 million. And the state is going to be required to submit a state application that is the plan for how we're going to support schools in reopening and in-person instruction and addressing learning loss. As a state, we're extremely well positioned for this because we've been reopened, since September. We've been in a hybrid disposition, but we're in much better position than most other states. So we should not really have any issues addressing that. So I think that with that, it might make sense. I've covered most of this, right? I've talked about equitable services. I've talked about the period of performance. I've talked about the buckets of money. I think that what I would like to do, if there aren't any additional questions, sort of the technical questions, is allow Dr. Boucher to speak about the recovery work that we're doing and how it ties to ESSER funding, and then also be able to open up the floor for questions around the set aside. The last thing that I will signal, there's sort of 2 more points. The ESSER 3 fund is different from the previous 2. The previous 2, the first one was very much an emergency response. Get the funds out to the field, you know, get the money in the districts so that they can respond. ESSER 2, sort of a similar, like we're tying it to the recovery planning that they're doing right now. ESSER 3 has very specific spending mandates from the U.S. Department of Education, which the previous 2 did not. So I want to sort of raise awareness about this. The first is that the LEAs are required to use 20%, and so of that 256 million, that's about $51 million, specifically for activities to address learning loss through evidence-based interventions, and then there's a list of things. So they will have to meet that requirement. They also have some other requirements, including the development and public posting of a plan to return to in-person learning. Again, we are very well positioned to do that, and in a lot of ways, the recovery plan is that plan. So there's double work happening there. The SEA, which is the Agency of Education, has also some specific spending mandates, and I have a handy pie chart there for us to look at these. So the first is that same learning loss identification, and that's of the 28 million or so that we are receiving in the SEA set aside, 14.2 million of that needs to go to address learning loss. The next is 2.8 million for after school programs, 2.8 million for summer enrichment programs, 1.43 million is reserved for the administration of these programs. And then that leaves about just over 7 million that's unmandated, meaning that we can use it however is strategically the best to address COVID. And I also just wanted to signal the agency's approach to the set aside and our thinking around it, and this will be part of our discussion, no doubt. We wanted to signal that our guiding principle here is that these are one-time funds with a very long tail, and that we're just beginning the work of recovery. The fund should be focused on education recovery, and we need to have a clear understanding of what the needs are in the field before we can begin to strategically allocate these funds. So some areas that we have identified at this point, but again, we want to get more information, and Dr. Boucher will be speaking to this in just a moment. One is improving school facilities, indoor air quality, and other health and safety issues. And I believe you just spoke with Cassandra Ryan about some of those issues. The second is supporting integrated service delivery models in all regions. So identifying regional approaches where perhaps school districts don't have the capacity to be delivering integrated sort of services. And then the last is addressing learning loss through expanding capacity for remote learning or just generally addressing learning loss. The last 2 slides show what we have already budgeted in our set asides. As you can see, ESSER 1 was very much sort of a communication response. So what structures do we need to put in place to be able to respond to the field effectively at the beginning of the pandemic? And then the ESSER 2 set aside, at this point, we've identified the Burlington High School Macy's retrofit as for $3.5 million as our item that we've already budgeted for that. So with that, I will stop sharing. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
We have have until about a little before 4:30 for this discussion, since we have other witnesses. But I think one question I have, and I'm glad that Mr. Klein is also, the AOE set aside. Steve, are you there? I'd rather ask it while he or Ms. Parker or Mr. Pearl, if one of them might be there. Okay. So there we are. Ms. Parker, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm trying to get Steve Klein here as well.
My question is with regard to the AOE set aside, and as the Joint Fiscal Office, and I think this is also for the Agency of Education, who has the authority to distribute those funds? Is it shared with the legislature? Is it are these dollars in the Treasury? Could you say something about that? Because I know that we have already used some of those funds. I could be wrong. So any clarification would be helpful.
Maybe we could have, Brianna actually has a spreadsheet on this. I don't know if you've gone over that or you want to do that, Brianna?
Well, I'm just wondering the answer to that question. Is it a yes, no, or somewhere in between?
Okay, unfortunately, I was on the phone with Adam Gresham, so I decided, so why don't you ask it again?
Okay, so the question is, the AOE set aside dollars, who has authority to appropriate those dollars?
Okay, and our position is that you as a legislature have authority. This is the AOE set aside dollars are into the Treasury, and once it's in the Treasury, the Constitution, Article 27 says they're appropriated by the General Assembly. And so that's been our position in this discussion.
Yep, no, that's helpful. I appreciate that clarification. And of course, you know,
Mr. Chair.
Yes, one moment. Of course, we would take the agency into consideration during those kinds of conversations, but I know that question has been raised and that's helpful. Dr. Boucher, please.
I do think it's a bit of a gray area. I think Mr. Klein is correct, but there is language in the actual ESSER statute that says that appears to give the agency direct authority on not appropriation, but on how to decide how to spend the funds. And I don't think that has been fully or sufficiently debated to a shared conclusion.
I think that while there is a gray area, I think our argument would be the legislature appropriates the money. There is room for the agency to work with the legislature on making sure the federal guidelines are respected. And so I think, as I understand it, and I think we had a conversation, Dr. before, that was sort of where you were coming down, that you know, as long as the agency is involved in.
Yes, so we're not interested in what we're.
I'm sorry, I want Mr. Klein to have an opportunity to finish and then begin.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. No, my understanding is our position is that we appropriate the money in the legislature. There are some differences in that there is an underlying statute called excess receipts, and to a very limited extent, excess receipts gives the Commissioner of Finance the authority to spend some money, and that's so that there may be some cases where the agency has spent money that the legislature didn't appropriate, and that would fall under that statute, just in the way we construct the law here in Vermont. Yeah. But as I was saying, I think that we're not. Yeah, maybe I'll be quiet. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I'm not looking to really debate it. Joint Fiscal advises the legislature, and the agency has individuals that advise them as well as it relates to this. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about this. Dr. Boucher, the final word on this is yours. And then if you wouldn't mind moving to the update.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I just wanted to add, the position of the agency is not at all that we solely have jurisdiction over spending this money we're very interested with no input or partnership with any other entity. We're very interested in working with the legislature on that. I think we would rather we not really focus on where the authority in terms of appropriating the dollars comes from, and really get a shared understanding of what is allowed with these funds, and then also hopefully working together so that there's a strategic appropriation and allocation of funds, because as Jill said, there's a long tail on these dollars that potentially go out through 2024 with what's called a tidings amendment. So I don't want to give the impression that we are interested in debating the appropriations issue. We're not. We're really interested in working together. As Jill mentioned, for this last bucket, there is a state plan that we need to put forth, and we'd be really happy to work with the legislature in terms of coming up with a shared plan of what we're going to do with the funds.
We would absolutely welcome your partnership and your testimony. And we certainly would not appropriate anything without hearing from all of you. So thank you for that. I appreciate it very much. Okay, so an update, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So as you'll recall, we have required a formal recovery planning process from each of our districts. And when I say districts, I mean supervisory unions. We all know that there's some nitty gritty in Vermont, but I hope you understand what I'm talking about. It's the unit that is supervised by a board and typically has a superintendent, just to clarify. So they were charged with coming up with their what is called a recovery planning team and identifying a recovery planning coordinator. They've all done that. We urged them to adopt a broad view and not just focus on school personnel for these recovery teams, but actually to think broadly. For many of our districts, really trying to get them to kind of push the envelope a little, think about community partners, after school programs, other entities, perhaps pediatricians or even private mental health clinicians. Certainly their designated agencies for providing mental health services and their regional division of child and family offices. And for the most part, most have done that, which is really great to see. So they've completed that initial piece about really getting together who's who. And now in 2 short weeks, they will be actually providing or submitting to the agency their needs assessment. So again, to remind the committee, this is an endeavor where each district needs to do a needs assessment on how students are doing in each of those 3 areas. So how are they doing in terms of mental health, social emotional learning, well-being? How are they doing in terms of engagement? We know that that's been a real issue. And again, all the way from just seeing students who, are slacking off a little more, maybe not showing up to school as much as they had before the pandemic, all the way to full-blown truancy and families that we know have really been it's been really hard for districts to connect with them and to maintain a communication with them. And so students are kind of lost. That's the second bucket. The third is, of course, academics. And so thinking about unfinished learning, where are students in terms of, comparing where they were pre-pandemic to now. So again, that information is going to be coming in on April 15th. So what we're hopeful is that we can actually come together to actually think about within the areas that are identified under the primarily ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 buckets, we take a look at the broad themes that are actually emerging, and then that's how we actually talk about our state initiatives. And so one of the things that's really important to clarify is that 90% of these dollars are, of course, going to the LEA, but the LEAs can't really, with those dollars, they're not going to be really able to engage a whole heck of a lot in any kind of regional work. It's really meant to be work that's happening like at the bounds of their district and really figuring out how to purpose those dollars to really get at those issues we just talked about, but within their district. And we think it's really important, particularly in some of our more rural areas, particularly in some of our areas that have historically really had struggles even before the pandemic with human services access, to really use our state set aside so that we can actually help build some of that regional infrastructure. So that is some of our thinking. But again, we're really interested in partnering with the legislature to think about that. And again, it's because we want to actually think about, hopefully collectively, we want to think about how to use these state set aside resources to do real state work, so that programs and sort of one-off kind of smaller initiatives can actually be done at the local level. So I think that's an important distinction we kind of want to continue talking about perhaps and keep thinking about. I did, so that's coming
I'm
in
sorry,
on April
Dr.
15th.
Boucher, I'm going to interrupt you. Senator Lyons.
So as I'm listening, and I'm also looking at the list of elementary, secondary school emergency relief allocations. And so I have two questions for you. The first one is about that, the allocations. And just briefly, can you remind me how those allocations were determined? And I don't
Which
know who
allocation?
answers. We have a table with all of the school districts. And then we have ESSER 1, 2, and 3, and then the total allocation amounts. And so I'm just curious as to how the allocations were put in place.
Thank you for clarifying. Yes, those came directly from USDOE. So those are US Department of Education. So they're based on a formula fund that tracks largely with title funding. So the Agency of Education, have no control over those allocations. They were told to us.
Thank you.
Okay, so they're told to you, but then are you looking to for any accountability on on the utilization of those funds?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Senator Lyon.
So
So
there's a plan,
yeah.
there's the reporting and the benefit that comes from the use of those.
Yes, and I'm smiling because I'd love to give you a whirlwind tour of our grants management system, so you could see what that actually looks like. I'm quite sure you might tell me to turn it off after about 5 minutes because it's very thorough. But yes, so for each of just to back up a bit, so each of the districts, they need to apply for these grants. They're theirs, but they need to apply to them to actually show that they are meeting the requirements, that they are actually falling within, is this a is this a COVID recovery expense? Is this within the list that's been identified? That it's not really an exercise for us about, nitpicking or anything. Like we've been pretty, these really are your dollars. So as long as you're showing that you're meeting the requirements put forth by the federal law, that's fine. I thought you were going to go in a different place, if I may.
Go ahead, because I have another question, but maybe you'll answer it before I ask it. We'll find out.
So a big question on the minds of a lot of folks, including us, has always been, so the bulk of the dollars clearly are going to that local level. Do we have any way to actually direct the spending of those funds? So technically the answer is no.
That was my second question, but not my third. Go ahead.
Yeah. So technically the answer is no, and our hands are tied. We really cannot direct the districts on how to spend their local dollars. However, we can certainly provide technical assistance. We can certainly provide suggestions about how to spend those dollars. And that's certainly something that we've been doing all along. As Jill, as Ms. Briggs Campbell just talked about, as part of our guidance, we give them some pretty concrete ideas within these buckets of, things to think about in terms of how to spend your dollars. You can spend these dollars certainly on mental health services. Here are some examples of how to do that. You can spend these dollars to hire someone who, will literally go and knock on families' doors because you don't have that capacity as a school to actually find out like what's going on with our kids and families. So I think it's important to kind of talk about that because that's some of the types of activities we're talking about. So yes, we can't say you shall spend your money on this, but a lot of our districts are looking to the agency for some guidance and some assistance. And so we're definitely interested in helping them out with that.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And then also, as you were talking, you were mentioning coordinating work with the DAs and the SSAs. And obviously, my concern would be that those organizations don't become overly burdened, but at the same time that they are available for the school access. And so how are you coordinating with the summer after school programs that may also include some of the counseling or other work that might go on? And it seems to me a Herculean task to coordinate all of this. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of how might happen.
Absolutely. And that's another great question, which I'm happy to share an update on. So two responses to that really great question. So you might recall that I had talked about each district having its own state support team. So that is actually happening. And we've actually already started that process. I forgot to mention each of the districts has already been assigned their initial state recovery team. But AOE has also been having very good, we're all in this together, conversations with both DCF and AOE or DMH, which is personally very exciting to me because this is my 6th year. I've never been in the room with both mental health, DCF, and the Agency of Education coming together in a shared way like this. So it's very exciting. And we recognize that at the state level, even, we have more bodies to actually put toward this work because this is the work that our existing continuous improvement staff do. So we've been very careful to be thinking about, okay, with the new deputy commissioner for DCF, with Commissioner Squirrel and Laurel Omland, how do you want to fit in with this? We really want you to. How does that look? And we're having ongoing conversations about doing some joint webinars, doing some joint work together. It's, we don't think that there's enough capacity at the state level yet for, someone from those state agencies to kind of go out into the field like we hope to, but we're really coming at this together and really trying to maximize the resources we have. We also might, be able to actually use some of these state dollars to really bolster that integrated work. At the field level, so field meaning at that district level, I'm really excited in this. I talked a little bit about sort of what their recovery teams look like. I think there's always improvement there in terms of making sure everyone who should be around the table is there, and we'll continue to push with that. Definitely, we know that capacity at the local level is an issue and is a problem, definitely. And we're very attuned to trying to bring in and use again, like some of these state dollars so that we can actually help build out that local infrastructure. So when when DAs can't actually find someone to hire, are there other ways we can help them figure out new technologies, for instance? Like, I'm not sure we're using telehealth as much as we could. Now, do we think that's a perfect solution to in-person counseling or services? Of course not. But is it something we can probably do a better job of for this emergency and recovery? Sure. But again, we'll be working on that together. I have a lot to say, so I promise I'll be quiet. But I do want to mention the after-school piece because we are working very closely with Vermont After School, also with Department of Mental Health, with Department of Fish and Wildlife, with Voc Rehab, and also with a bunch of folks who are actually in the field, both in terms of the private campsite and then also 21C programs, to actually make sure that we are offering a robust ecosystem this summer for students. And so we are very excited about using some of our state set aside. And as you'll recall from what Jill said, we're mandated to in ARPA anyway, to actually bolster that after school plus environment, because we don't want it just to be standard after school. We really want to invite folks who perhaps haven't been part of initiatives beforehand. So even some community camps or community programs that hadn't really thought about being part of an ecosystem and have just relied on, a very small fingerprint or footprint before this summer. Another piece that we're really focused on is ensuring that all students have access to some summer activity focused on recovery. So we're really putting out, and we're designing right now, and we're putting out some important information for both families and, again, for new programs that maybe not in the past have not thought that they could actually serve students with special needs, to actually help them understand that they can, and then provide them the resources so that they can actually bring that to bear. We're not expecting that this just happens on the current, the current fiscal platform, if you will. That's not the right word. It's late in the day.
Can I ask two more questions?
Yes, please.
Mr. Chair. So are there, and they're not, they are probably not related, but so one of the questions is simple. Are you working with the Department of Labor? I know that they've moved into the schools now for supporting kids who are looking for jobs and moving out. So are you coordinating with DOL as well on that?
Yes, and so we're actually working with DOL. I neglected to mention them, and I'm sorry, and they would probably really give me some grief over that, because we have had a good partnership with DOL for the past 5 years, really strong partnership. So I forgot to mention there, so all of this work is actually going to be on Vermont After School's website, so that it will actually be sort of a hub for families to actually go and take a look at what options are in their region. And definitely a strand that we're working on is, what about youth? What about older students who might not be interested in a typical summer camp kind of experience? We hope we can entice them to be counselors, actually, but that's with some paid opportunities, which is where labor comes in. And so that's definitely a part of it, along with voc rehab.
All right, thank you. That's really neat and very helpful. Because I happen to be talking with someone who's involved with that type of counseling, and so I just wanted to know if you were working with that. Hang on,
I'm very
noise
happy
in the
to
back.
follow. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm very happy to follow up with any additional materials that you might like to see about this too. So it's not just lip service.
Oh, that's great. I'll ask my other question another time. It's really about kids who are not defined as disabled or having or special education, but who may fly under the radar screen. So kids with some illnesses that are not so don't rise to the level of SSI, for example. So just someday we can talk about that. Just want to know how those kids are handled within the system itself.
And we put in the expedited budget monies for after school and a number of the other things that you've also referenced. I know that is on the House floor either today or tomorrow, depending on where things are at. So I'm sure there'll be some negotiations, and I know that the agency was in to support our work earlier on that. So thank you for that. Other updates. I'm going to postpone Mr. Peralt and Ms. Parker, only because I don't want you to have to rush. And we do have a 4:30 meeting, and we have a hard stop before 5 o'clock, given other commitments. So I just want to, Dr. Boucher, are there other updates that you would like to provide while you have the floor? Highlights?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Yes, so on this summer, what's happening this immediate summer, I have started, I put out a little informal poll to our districts, our superintendents, and I've heard from about 40% of them. And all of them are planning on offering summer programming, and the vast majority of them are also partnering with 21C or some other community after school to actually integrate the after school or the camp kind of format with academics, which is great. And I'm happy as I haven't actually formalized that data or that information, but I'm happy to come back and share that if that's of interest to the committee. I feel pretty pleased about where they are right now with that. I think that they're really taking this seriously. The only other thing I would say is that I want to again impress on the committee that we are very interested in working together with the committee. I think we are all in agreement about sort of the broad strokes of what it is we need to invest in. And I think we're just looking forward to continuing to be part of that conversation with you all.
Thank you. Okay, any questions? Appreciate that. My apologies, Ms. Parker and Mr. Pearl, but looking through what Ms. Parker sent, it warrants more than a quick overview. So Jeannie will be in touch with you, and hopefully we'll have you in tomorrow later in the day if that works for the two of you.
Yes, thank you, Senator Campion.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Ms. Briggs, Dr. Boucher, if there's nothing else, thank you both very much appreciate it. And committee, why don't we just take a quick stretch and come back in a little before 4:30, and we will spend our remaining time on school and technical committees. Thanks.